Good afternoon. My name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm talking about Microsoft Azure governance, provisioning, and desired state. It's kind of a across-the-board type of topic. Azure IaaS is infrastructure as a service, and by that we typically mean virtual machines. So when we talk about a solution I worked at a client of mine where we had SharePoint people request virtual machines, and then we had a process in the back to go through and make sure we would provision them using code so that we knew what they looked like, and we were able to do some enforcement about policies and security and so on to make sure that all these machines were in fact identical to help kind of reduce our support costs and so on. So who in the room does management, IT pro, governments, right? A couple developers, a couple of them, right? And I guess the rest of you are probably what I call money men, right? You got budget. So obviously I knew this talk was kind of a cross-discipline, if you will. So a little bit of PowerShell, a little bit of Visual Studio, a little bit of Slide. Hopefully it makes sense. And like I said, we're a little less than an hour, but I think we'll be okay. A little about me, right? So again, I'm an independent consultant. I've worked with many different larger organizations, through partnerships and so on. I actually worked with Ben for a few years as well. The information's up here. I have a little card I can give you if you want to reach out to me later. The last name's a bit hard to spell, although I find the Europeans do much better at it than the Americans do. I'm from Chicago, Illinois, so those of you coming to Ignite, it's my hometown. Welcome. Spend a lot of money for us. That'd be great. And again, there's this up here. I started as a developer on the IBM mid-range computer, morphed into a portal server. It became SQL Server Digital Dashboard, which became SharePoint, yada, yada, yada. Been doing that a long time. But as you can imagine, once you get a little gray in the beard, then people tend to think that you are experienced and know a lot of stuff, and that's where I kind of transitioned into this role that I just wrapped up, where I actually sat with what they called the infrastructure group, and none of them wrote code. All of them clicked on buttons. And so part of the task there was to say, we know that we need to go from 0 virtual machines to 200 plus in probably 3 months. How many times can you click a button? And how often will you do it the same way every time, right? And so because the PowerShell framework that's out nowadays helps us to automate this type of thing, it's great, but if you've never done code before, how do you do PowerShell, right? So that's kind of where I fit into that role. So we're going to talk about how our use of Microsoft Azure, and it just occurred to me, I think I might have forgot to put in the picture about that, so I'll talk through that. And then I'll cover these 3 main things about the governance that we did, the provisioning process we did, how we set up some basic monitoring, and then the takeaways. I just want to make sure I can point you to the resources. So what we did in Microsoft Azure is as I said, it's infrastructure as a service is the official name of it, right? So how many here have used Azure? All right, so you're mostly familiar, okay? The key thing in this environment, we set up a site-to-site VPN, right? There was no appetite whatsoever to go to the cloud within this organization. But it was quite simple to say, here's what we're going to do. We'll create this VPN. And first we started using a point-to-site VPN, which is all software. Created a virtual machine in the cloud, set up the point-to-site VPN, which basically means you run a VPN client on your local PC, and it connects up to an IP address in the cloud. Then we went into the Azure interface, and we removed all the public endpoints. And I said, go find your server in the cloud, right? When I removed the public endpoints, those servers are no longer in the cloud. And in addition, because I had the point-to-site VPN running, I told the guy, come in here, sit down on this VM I just created for you, and join it to the domain. And lo and behold, they joined to the domain. So they understand, hey, it's really just a virtual machine in a data center that just happens to be run by someone who's not us. And that was more palatable than saying cloud, right? So again, it's a perception problem. Typically, it's what I find, a political or a perception problem. Really, the technology is really easy to solve, right? However, point-to-site VPN is not sustainable because not everybody in the whole company is going to install this VPN client, right? And so we actually had to work with the network team and put in the site-to-site VPN. If you haven't done that yet, that requires either a routing and remote services server, or it requires dedicated hardware, right? And so that's the extent of my knowledge about networking. I know that you can do next, finish, or you can put in some hardware. And so that's what we did. And I'm sorry I forgot to put the picture in here. Right? So that in general, that's what we're doing, right? So all I'm really doing now is just using Azure's data center and its web interface and or PowerShell interface to create assets that I can then consume on my network. Right? Yes?
Does this support open source routers and firewalls?
So his question is, does this support open source routers and firewalls? And I have no idea. I'm a developer. Yeah. So yeah, but I would, if it does Windows built the Windows feature called routing and remote services, whatever that protocol is, if you can do it. Okay. All right. So that's our Azure environment that we talked about. And now the G word, right? So governance. And so this, and I'll get into more detail on this here, right? And so remember, we're working in a people who don't like developers and aren't very comfortable with development, but I want to make sure we automate this, right? And so we just I took a step back and said, listen, we're going to do standard SharePoint-y things here, right? We're going to, remember the whole goal is to provide SharePoint, I mean, I didn't say this, right? These 200 VMs were to support a bunch of developers creating SharePoint 2010 full trust code. Now in 6 months, they're going to throw that all away and go to the app model, but that's a different story, right? So SharePoint is very familiar in this environment. So listen, why don't we use SharePoint for people to request these virtual machines, right? You can call the help desk, you can use a ticketing system, or we can just use SharePoint. I created a content type in a list. I'll go through this and show you an example just as a refresher in case you don't use the browser that much. But it's not only just this, right? Do you want to have approvals? We can do workflow, right? Anything that you can do in SharePoint, we can do here, right? And so, of course, we already have an intranet in place, so why don't we create a service catalog? And now you can request an Azure virtual machine, or we just told them request a virtual machine. I can show you some simple tricks that we can make this look like a custom interface. To do this, very simple to fill out without a lot of code work. So that's one of the takeaways is that you can do little snippets, right? So we'll go through and we'll do this. And I think that's the next slide is saying go to the demo. So let me put on the glasses and we'll launch the browser. Oops, wrong one. I want to hit this. And that's, let me log in here. I don't want to log in as Garth, I want to log in as me. Oops, wrong one, sorry. And, sites/service catalog. So what I have is just a simple, I'll show you what this is, then we'll look at the pieces, right? Simple team site. I took off all the built-in pieces here, and I just have this thing here and some verbiage, which I'm guessing you can't read. Let me zoom in a little bit on that, right? So I can just put any language with a button. And when I click the button, I'm using the Dialog framework, and I'm filling out a form, right? And so you can see here I have a title, a chargeback code, a size, and a status. Typical information here, right? So my code here will do 987, an A5 is good, I click save, and immediately you'll see there's one problem here, title, you can't leave the title blank. Well, I don't really care about a title, right? So I'll show you a technique we can do to fix that. For now, I'll just leave that blank, and I'll click save, and request is submitted. Simple enough, right? I can gather some stuff. So how do we do this? How do we make it better? This site has just a simple list that's called VM requests. And the VM request, if you recognize the icon, is just a custom list. And you can see here my title field, I'm not really filling out here, so what does this really mean? So I can change that. But before I get there, first thing I want to point out, just like any good SharePoint veteran would want to do, I'm doing some data, I want to make sure I capture this data in a structured manner. So I'm going to start by going to my site settings and going to the galleries, and I'm going to create a content type. Content types are made up of columns, so we'll show you what these look like here in a minute. So, who's familiar with site columns and content types? Okay, a few aren't, so the rest of you have to listen through, right? When we are putting data into SharePoint, we want to classify that data of some type. That's called a content type. Content types enable all kinds of capabilities. Go see Matt McDermott's search session. He'll talk about content types like crazy. So if you're going to be doing something, you want to make sure that you do the same kind of concept. So in my scenario, I need to capture data about a request for a virtual machine. So I want a content type called VM request. And then you can see down below here, what data am I going to capture? I want a chargeback code because I'm going to bill somebody for the VM. I want to know the size, and perhaps I want to have some feedback that says, what's the status, right? It doesn't just happen instantly. I need to do some stuff, right? And so when I want to create a new content type, by default, I chose the item-based content type, and every list item in SharePoint has a title, right? So that's why I have the title field that's coming in here. But this is my content type. And when I was creating this, I came in here, and at the bottom here it says add from new site column. You want to choose add new site column because SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint Online, site columns are automatically promoted to managed properties in search. So I have searchable properties here for these various fields if I want to use them in the future. Now, I get it. I don't necessarily want these VM search results in my main search center, right? But as I said, I might have 200 of them. And maybe I want to search for VM requests by a certain chargeback code or by a certain user. So I might want to do a search in this site collection against this list, right? Make sense? So I want to make sure I do that. After doing that, I went to Site Contents, and I chose to create, add an app, and I chose the default, this custom list. Custom list is basically, right, a list gives you a title and all the back-end fields that I need, like edited by, created by, date, time, all that good stuff. I created a custom list. I'll go ahead and create one now. And we'll just give this one a name called Demo. Once the list is created, I go into its settings. The first thing I would do is this advanced settings, and at the very top here, there's one that says allow management of content types. And I'm going to click on yes. And now you'll notice I have created modified title, right? Just a handful of fields. But now that I've chosen the content types, I can come in here and I want to add from existing content types. And when I do this, what I will end up is updating this list to have these additional fields. So now you'll see that in addition to the standard ones, I have my chargeback code, I have my status, okay? And again, if this is a repeat, I'm sorry, but last thing here, I click on this button that says change the new button order and the default content type. When I click new, I don't want item, I want my content type. So I simply come in here and make the item not visible. And when I do that, I now have a list. And when I click on the new button, I see the same thing, right? Look familiar? All right, so we're kind of there. Now, the next thing I want to do, well, in my case, I want to go to my list. So I went to VM requests. And again, I click the new item. And what I want to check down here is this URL, right? So let me copy this and I'll put it in Notepad so we can see it. Everything after the query string parameter I don't care about. So let me take that, get rid of it. And so you can see here I have my site. Start.aspx is the minimal download strategy, I know that, but everything after here you can see is the URL to my list, right? So I want to remember that. And so what I then did is I went into a little snippet of code here. Oh. And I have my request button, and now let's open this in Notepad so I can show you what this is doing. And I will, for now, I won't save it, but I'll put this on a new line here so you can see what's happening. And you probably can't see that. So this is a little bit of JavaScript that you may want to take in. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a snippet of HTML, right? And so at the top, I have JavaScript, and because me being a developer, this was second nature for me, I'm simply saying, I want you to use the SharePoint user interface library of JavaScript to use a dialog, right? So remember when I clicked on it initially, it opened up a dialog for me. And then I just chose request submitted. You may want to do something fancy here. But under the button here, under the covers, I have this button, and I'm running this open pop-up page. This is a function that exists on every SharePoint page because there's the sp.ui.js has that function. So as you can see here, it's 13 lines, or actually less than 13 lines of code for me to open up a dialog. And if you look here on the pop-up page, guess what that URL is? Right? And then there's a setting here that says what happens when I click the button. That check result is what we call a callback, and so on. So we can talk about that later. I don't take too much time. But I have what happens when I click the button, and then I have the text of the button, and that's all I put in here. I uploaded this file to a folder in my site. I think I chose site assets or something like that. Doesn't matter. But what I'm going to do is I'll go back to the home page. And I'll put this page in edit mode. And this is a content editor web part. The content editor web part has the property to say I can either type in the content directly if I wish, or I can just point it at a file. And so this here is the URL to that text file that I uploaded. And it's in my site assets library. Right? Simple enough. Boom, there we go. So now I have the dialog, right? You with me? How many people in here are allowed to use SharePoint Designer? Wow. Okay. How many people here decide whether SharePoint Designer is allowed or not? Do you block it?
Depends.
Depends, right? So in DINO 2013, there's more choices now, right? Okay. So it's much less harmful than it used to be, but it has some great advantages to using it. One of the beautiful things about using it is that I might be able to change a form, or a list form. And so I'm going to go to this list, and I can choose here, and there's an option to, right here, edit the list in SharePoint Designer. Come on, come on. Which doesn't always work, so let me SharePoint. Let me search for Designer. Where's my SharePoint Designer link? I'm sorry? Well, so this is my fault. Notice who's logged onto the machine. It's not Paul's account, because I don't want you to see all my email. So I forgot to install a different user. Oh, that's terrible. Okay, well, that's okay. Because I'm short on time, we're not going to do that. But in SharePoint Designer, I can then edit a list form. And what I would typically do is remove that title field from the top of the form, and I would put it at the bottom. But then there's a setting in there that you can have a default value. So there's a text box for the title, and I would put in a value something along the lines of not used, or just a single period, or whatever. But that text box is hidden. So I can just modify the HTML so that it's at the bottom, it's hidden, but so when I click OK, it gets a value, so I don't have an error, and yet I can customize the fields that I want. So when I click on this, I don't have to show them a title that they don't want to use. Now, in your scenario, maybe you want title, that's fine. That was just how I was going.
Is there an easy way to create a custom list template with your own structure to define which title?
So custom list templates are really not as favored as they once were. In SharePoint 2013, we really don't want a custom list template. We want a content type. So the answer to your question is yes. I would say don't write a custom list template. I would say create a content type. And yeah. Now, another option, you can use the JS link property to modify the forms as well. And there's some sessions on the CSR, custom client-side rendering, that'll do a similar concept. Or rename the title to be something that, right, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. I was just trying to give you a couple of tips. So that's where we're at. Okay, so that was my service request dialog. We all set? Content editor web part, content types, site columns, all in the browser, a little bit of JavaScript, and then off we go. Okay, so now that I have these lists, now what do I want to do? Okay, several approaches to do that, right? And so we can pull this list on a schedule. right? Write a console app, have it run every periodically, and figure and get that list, right? A couple things to keep in mind here. When I'm running this as a console app, the identity that's going to read the list is going to be the person running the console app. In scheduled tasks in Windows, I can say run as a certain account. Okay? That's one approach. I can write an app for SharePoint and say, hey, use app-only privileges. Again, that's easy for me, not so easy for a lot of other people. You can also use PowerShell. If you haven't used PowerShell, I strongly encourage you to do that. But one of the beautiful things about both PowerShell and some of the code is we can then make this identity work in a much more intuitive manner, much more controlled manner. And I'll show you that. By default, when I run PowerShell, it's the logged on user, same as a console app, right? Another option you'll see for PowerShell, who in here has used PowerShell, right? Okay. Have you done this where you take the password as a secure string and pipe it to a file so you have a junk, right? You don't have to do that anymore. You can use a certificate to talk back and forth, but again, that's being kind of de-emphasized in Azure. What I want to show you today is this Credential Manager option. Who's used Credential Manager in Windows? Oh, a couple, right? So this baby is beautiful, so let's talk about that. I'm going to go to Windows and I'm just going to type in credential, and there it is. Credential Manager has been around since, I believe, Windows 95, right? It's been around forever. Here is the Credential Manager. You'll notice the icon at the bottom is the control panel icon, and I have two sets here. I'm going to click on Windows Credential, and under Generic, you'll see I have one here that is my account. You probably can't read that. I don't have my Zoom It working. That's unfortunate. This is basically, it says Internet or Network Address, which is basically just a string to identify it. Username and password. Who's used Secure Store in SharePoint? That's what this is. Okay? So the presenter account is logged onto the physical machine, and so only the presenter account can see these entries in Configuration Manager. But this address is identified by a value that I know about. And so I want to use code to pull the credentials for the request to SharePoint from Credential Manager. And so when I, as a consultant, when I leave, I tell them, here you go. Well, you want to use a service account? Type a service account in here. You want to use your account? Type in your account. You want to leave it at my account? That's fine. It won't work once you disable my account, right? The good news is we can do this in both C#, yay, that's me, or we can do it in PowerShell. So to do it in PowerShell, I'm going to point you to, let me open another window here. Half an hour, okay. GitHub.com/office, I will go there. So there is a group in Microsoft called Patterns and Practices. And I'm sure you've probably seen that they're here this week. It's Vesa Vuhoven. I think I spelled that right. They have what we call a repository of code here. So let me log in. You don't have to log into GitHub, but if I knew the address, I would just type it in directly. And this is that. Killing me. So let me go to Office. Oh, so here we go. So let me. It's github.com/office dev. I'm sure that's what it is, right? Yep. /PNP. github.com/office dev/PNP. And I have this patterns and practices repository. The moral of the story here is down below you'll see there's this wiki. This information is moving to MSDN as well, so you can get it there. The reason I'm pointing this out to you is there is a set of PowerShell commandlets that were written by Erwin. And so I'm not seeing the link on here at the moment. The PowerShell commandlets do a lot of things to help you manage SharePoint Online using PowerShell. But the part that I really care about is there is a commandlet called get SPO credential, or get credential. Get credential is part of built-in PowerShell. That one says get SPO credential, and you can pass in the name of a credential manager entity, and it will read that value and give it to you as either a PowerShell credential or a network credential or a SharePoint Online credential. So again, I can use this PowerShell routine to just say, hey, get the credential for me out of the secure store and work with it. What I chose to do in my example, obviously I'm a code guy, so I use Visual Studio. So let me go into my request processing application here. So the devs in the room can all get, right? I'm sorry, say that again?
Does the Credential Manager gives you any problem when you do a password reset?
His question is, does Credential Manager give you a problem if you reset a password? All Credential Manager is doing is saving the value you typed in securely so no one can get it. If you change your password, the value stored is no longer valid, right? So you're going to get a login access denied or password failed message. So if the password changes, you'll have to go in there and change it yourself. So you still might want to have a service account, okay? Either way. So what I'm showing you here now for the devs in the room, and I have to do this because you lose your developer creds if you don't present in Visual Studio, so I'm doing that as well. I just have a simple application here, but what I've done is I set a reference to the Office Dev P&P, because guess what? In addition to a PowerShell commandlet to read the Credential Manager, they've given me a library of code that'll do a bunch of things, including that. Right? So when you go back to the office, tell your devs, get the P&P stuff rather than writing a password in plain text. Here's my app. There's a lot of junk in here, and I will not show all of it, but one thing I want to point out here is there's a lot of talk about, or many people have had a discussion about what's the best way to detect things or do inside of SharePoint. And so what we've always done in SharePoint on-prem, 2007, 2010, we had these things called event receivers. And so when an item is changed or added to a list, SharePoint would fire some code for me, right? What we call fire an event, all right? And developers love it because rather than having to actively look for something, I can just be lazy and react to an event that happens, right? We all love to react instead of be proactive, right? That's a joke. But now when we move to SharePoint Online, they have what they call remote event receivers. Remote event receivers are basically a network call from the online service to an endpoint that you define. What happens if the network connectivity breaks? Office 365 does not guarantee delivery of an event. It's not part of the service definition. So instead of waiting for an event to happen, I'm going to have a process that wakes up periodically and queries the service to see what's changed. That, to me, is a better solution than waiting for an event that may never end up. Now, if you're using workflows use what we call service bus technology to make sure that workflows will, in fact, fire in response to events that happen in the service. Remote event receivers do not. And so my code is set up here to go through, and we have this thing called the change token. Every list, every site collection, site, and list inside of SharePoint has the ability to track what's changed, and every change has a stamp. Think of it as a version number, if you will. And so what I've got here, the sample code that we'll share with you, is that I will run through and say, give me the list of changes, and when I'm done processing all the changes, I'll take the token of the last change and save it. And then next time I run, I'll pull that token from where I stored it and say, okay, SharePoint, give me anything that's happened after this token. So every time I wake up, I get changes that have happened since the last time I ran. To me, that's a more effective method than waiting for stuff to happen back. And so that's what I'm doing here. And another thing to point out here, you can see here that it says item equals true and add equals true. Let's think about what my scenario is at the moment, right? I'm having you click on a button, add an entry to a list because you want a new virtual machine. That's all I need. So all I really care about is if a list item is added. I don't care if you've deleted one. I don't care if you've changed one. All I'm trying to do is get a new request and act on it. So I'm filtering my query to say only if the thing that changed is an item, and only if it's an add. Okay? And so that's what this code is doing here. It's saying get my last token and do this query. And then I come down here and I start processing it. One thing to keep in mind, I'll add a comment to the in here what's going on. Let's say that I run this thing every hour. It is entirely possible that an item could be added and then deleted in that same hour, right? So just because SharePoint says, hey, there was an item added, doesn't mean it's still there. So I'm doing a little defensive coding that says, hey, do a query, and basically I'm saying, hey, I'm going to query the list for that certain item number, and if I get it back, then I'm going to process it. Now in my code, right, I'm doing demo stuff. I can't give you the code, right? I wrote it for a client, but we're just checking to see you do some validation, whatever the rules may be, unique to your situation. And then the last bit of code at the end is just making sure that, hey, whatever that last token that you got from the service, I want you to save that into a file. So I'm going to just hit the button here and run this because I added an entry, right? So I added one first thing. If you remember on my view, I had 2 items, right? The first one I added this morning when I was making sure my code was working. Second one I added here, right? And so we don't care about the logging. Let me zoom past that, although I make sure I have a breakpoint set, so we'll just keep continue. And so, okay, we'll go through here, and there we go, there's an error. And null reference. Oh, you know what? If you remember when I logged in, I did that wrong, so let me go into my settings and make sure I've got that right. Where is my... this credential name is different. See, here my credential name is this, Paul at S. So let me change that. That'd be Paul. And we'll try that again. I'm just making sure here, and I'm clearing the service. Okay, good, good. So a couple things I want to show you in here, right? So I run through this, right? So I want to show you my last token. And so you can see here this last process token, if I hover over it, see it says 1, semicolon, 3, semicolon, and a big string of something or other, right? I really don't care what that format means. Part of that is the date and time. Part of that is the list information. Again, I don't care because I'm saying I only want to process this one list. So I'm going to come down here and make sure I do have another breakpoint set. So we'll hit continue again. And so you'll see here where I get an item that was changed, right? And so this change has some information. Notice it's an add, and I have the token for that. This individual change has a token. So every time I get something that's changed, it's given to me and say, here's what the token is for this item, remember? And so in this particular scenario, I'll just let this continue. Again, I don't really do much with it. I would expect you would do that. I'll switch over to the log, though. But what ended up happening here is there actually were 2 changes that had happened. Number one is that on the first request item, this code at the very end here, this code at the end, I'm actually updating the list that says, hey, the provision status is something. Okay, so I'm actually going back and updating every item as I process it. So there were 2 changes in the system. I only got 1 because only 1 was an add. To show you that, let me go back to the site. And it's this, come on, here. If I go to these items here, and we'll choose the second one here. Let's view the item. And so you'll see that it is queued for provisioning, right? And so that's modified, well, I didn't set the time, but a minute ago, right? So we track the information, we find a way to pull it back. Again, you don't have to use C# code. You can do this with PowerShell. You can do it with humans, whatever the case may be. I need to zoom through. So now that we have this, what do we do with it, right? What we did, again, is we had the site-to-site VPN. We had a custom sysprepped image, right? I'm a developer. I didn't create the image. It was given to me, right? So we took this sysprep image and we uploaded it to Azure. And then when I create a virtual machine in Azure, I can say use that base image for the new operating system disk in Azure. We use the classic Azure Service Management PowerShell. There is a new thing called Resource Manager, which gives you better templating of how you want the virtual machine to look. So if you look at the script that I'm showing you, it does a lot of steps. After the machine's created, I do a lot of steps to create additional disk and do some configuration of the machine because the resource manager wasn't available at the time we started. So there's an option to do that. Again, we were implementing a predefined machine, right? We knew there were A5s in our example, and we knew that it had a system disk and a data disk, and that was it. And they were set at certain sizes because developers, if you give them a gigabyte of disk space, guess how much they'll use? A gigabyte. How much do they need? Not a gigabyte, right? We've all seen that. We then went through and installed SQL Server and SharePoint using, unattended installs. Right? So a SQL Server answer file, AutoSP installer, you can do a bingle for the search for those if you want to learn more. I'm not a SharePoint administrator. It wasn't the best SharePoint high availability install in the world because you know what? A developer doesn't need that, right? All I need is the web interface and maybe the search service. So that's what we did. I will show you real quick the PowerShell that we did because I'm running low on time. So let me go back up here. And here's our thing. So let me edit this. So I'm going to use the Windows PowerShell integrated scripting environment, which gives us some color coding. And let me go to full screen. And so this is what we did. All right. Just let me walk through the steps. If you have questions, we'll go through that. Right. So again, I could say pass in a parameter for the size. We defaulted to a certain one. I had a file in which I was storing what the next number is. So you can imagine we needed to name these servers, right? And so what was the naming convention? We did that. That was all part of in here, right? One thing to keep in mind, we had two names to deal with. There was a name inside the Windows Azure portal, and there was the name in the domain. Okay? We chose to go different between the two just because we were given a specific naming convention for the on-prem. It had to be AZ with a 4-digit number, right? Well, in the Azure portal, by the time we got to this project, we already had ADFS servers up there. We already had some other proxy servers running. So we wanted to know which machines were for which purpose. So we had a different name in Azure than we had on-prem. Again, that's the naming convention you'll want to set up. In addition, as you're naming things in Azure, you want to think through these names. If you do the wizard, anyone done this in Azure, you go and say create a new virtual machine in there, right? You give it a name, and you end up with 12 things with the same name, right? Visual Studio does the same thing if you just follow the wizards. So we actually went through and did a planning exercise, and we were naming things a specific way. We had virtual machines, we had cloud services, we had availability sets, we had an availability group. We actually went through and did a naming exercise so that as we provision these, we know what to do here, okay? And so we actually then defined, we knew we had a virtual network in Azure, we had a separate subnet for all these devices. SharePoint in a box is what SIB stands for, by the way, right? So you can see that we did all that. All kinds of prep work at the beginning. Then we had our well-known image. This was the name of the file they gave us, right? Halloween, appropriately enough. It was the scariest time, right? And so we end up, what we're doing here is a copy. So we took this image that was provided to us, we stuck it in a corner somewhere, and then we made a copy of that image into a new storage account in Azure.
Is that on the same storage, the Azure tenant, the same Azure tenant?
So his question is that in the same X, right? We copied from one storage account to a separate storage account. They were in the same subscription in the same data center. 60 gigabyte file took about 5 seconds. Uploading that file from on-prem to the cloud took overnight, right? It is possible to copy across any scope in Azure. If it's the same subscription, it'll basically be a pointer copy, if you will, almost like copying a snapshot. If it's in a different subscription or a different data center, then it'll be an actual byte copy. So we did that. And then here's that option here that says wait for completion. So we would issue the call, wait for it to complete. When that was done, we would then create a new data disk. So right here, so we're doing here, so I'm sorry, this is the part where we said, okay, I just created a brand new copy of the sysprep image. I defined that with a certain name. And then I'm saying, I want you to create a new virtual machine. Again, this is the older Azure PowerShell commandlet for service management, right? So I'm defining what size, I'm giving it, this is the name of the disk I just created, I just copied, and then I'm going to add a data disk, and again, I'm giving it a certain URL. This is all, most of it is understood, some of it was parameterized. I'm setting my subnet, and here I create the new VM in a cloud service. Couple of things to note. By default, when you get Azure, you get, I think, 20 cores, which is probably not enough for anything. You make a service request that's free, they can bump it up to whatever you want. The response I got was, well, we don't want you to go from 0 to 1,000 cores in a day without us knowing that it's coming. So it took them about 48 hours to bump up my limit. But the guy did tell me, if you call when they're getting low, it may take 5 business days for them to scale their capacity to handle your needs. So plan ahead on what you'll need. There is also a limit on cloud services. Again, you can bump it up a little bit, but again, try to think ahead, what am I going to do here? In our scenario, we didn't need multiple cloud services. Remember, a cloud service is how I can access these resources from the cloud. I wasn't accessing mine from the cloud. So I put them all in the same cloud service because I didn't care, right? Also, a cloud service is part of where you get the high availability service level agreement. These are developer machines for me. Again, I didn't care. I didn't need to have them load balanced or always available, but you might want to do that depending on your scenario. So that's the code on how to create a VM. Next thing you did is I just told it to sleep for a little bit and to wake up every once in a while and look for a certain name. Once it was, because I knew that sysprep image had the license, whatever the file is in Windows, to automatically give it the license code for volume license. And then when it was done, we could do this thing called a custom script extension. This is a beautiful thing. It basically says, I want you to copy these files from the storage account and put it into this VM. And then once they're all copied, an agent on the VM will run a specific one. So it would run this initial setup file, which would go through and resize the operating system disk, and it would format my data disk, right? When I got my operating system disk, 128 gigabyte VHD, it wasn't full. So we shrunk it down as small as we could so it would upload faster, and because it would cost less to store it. And then once it was up there, we'd say, hey, make it bigger. And the same thing with the data disk. When you get a brand new disk added to a VM in Azure, the operating system doesn't know it's there. You have to go into the storage management and initialize the disk and format the volume and all that kind of stuff, right? You can do it as whatever storage stuff you can do in Windows Server, it's all there. By default, you don't get it. So again, this is stuff we wanted to do. We want to enforce our consistency. We set that to happen there, and then it just waits for that process to finish. We use the same custom script, but now we were renaming it. Remember, we set our names at the top. We know what the name of the new one should be. We could rename it. And at the bottom, there was a script that would say, join the domain. So we got the network guys used whatever tool they have. They created an exe that would join the domain. It automatically had the permissions it required to join the domain. So I was able to provision a couple hundred VMs, and I never had permission to join a computer to the domain. They delegated that out, right? And so that's what this script does for us, okay? I think it's typical steps, right? The point is, we just tried to abstract the repeatable parts and parameterize them, and off we go. Make sense? What am I doing here? I got 10 minutes. All right.
How long did it take to go from 0 to 200 VMs?
Oh, I wasn't there at past 50, but it would take, to provision the VM took about 30 minutes. I would, you click the save button once it got approved.
Just in business days, a week or the last 10 days?
So from the time the workflow approved the request, and well, so there was a delay for the wake up, right? But once the process decided to create a new VM, it took about 30 minutes for the VM to get to this stage, joined onto the domain. Installing SQL Server took about 2.5 hours. Installing SharePoint took even longer because of the service packs that were going on here. But that's because they purposely chose a small, underpowered VM and a single disk for these developers. If I was going to do a production SharePoint, I'd have 8 disks instead of 1, right? So, but the point was, human intervention was just to prove it, and it would go. So we said, we'll get you a VM in 1 business day, which the users loved. Because in the old days, they would call the data center, and sometimes they'd say, I'll get it to you tomorrow. Sometimes they'd say, we have to get a purchase order for a new hypervisor server. It could be 6 months, right? So that's what we did there. Okay? Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So, monitoring. I put this in here, and then it occurred to me, you know what? Monitoring to me meant something different than most IT pros, right? All we were trying to do here is we wanted to make sure that these developers weren't going in here and creating some wacky configuration on their VM that was going to either cost more than it should, or they would get too far away from what the production environment might look like. All right? So we wanted to make sure we did that. And so, and in addition, what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that the team I was working on could always log on to the VM. Right? Never fails, right? There's a lawsuit or whatever happens, what's this guy doing? We wanted to be able to get in there. So we used what they call the desired state configuration to go through and make sure we had permissions, make sure that disks were automatically formatted and set up as needed. And in addition, we could set the page file settings. Again, this was a convenience we were doing for them. All right? DSC has what they call a push model or a pull model. And what that means is if you want, you can set up a server that has PowerShell configurations, and you can have every other machine check it and pull the configuration and apply it, or you could push them to a machine. We chose the push option because, guess what? I'm provisioning the machine. I know it's there. I can push the configuration. Built into this DSC is that every 30 minutes, it looks at the desired state, and it enforces that desired state. So once I push the configuration that I wanted onto a machine, it would wake up every 30 minutes and make sure that was met. Okay? So every 30 minutes, it would make sure our account was in the local admin group. It would look at the storage manager. If there was a disk that was uninitialized, it would initialize the disk. And again, we would check to make sure page file was on the SSD drive instead of on a blob. Right? A couple of little simple things, and I'll show you that code. It can be used for lots of things. Right? This is just what examples that we're going to show you here. Why did we choose DSC over group policy from Active Directory? The group I was in did not own Active Directory. And to be plain, it was one of those things, this is what we can do. In addition, how do you troubleshoot group policy settings? Right? I was working with a bunch of SharePoint guys, right? So it's much easier to look at what I'm going to show you than it would be to look at group policy. And I can never find that link to show me the desired effect. I know there's a place to say, show me what would happen. I can never find it. So I'm going to show you, I got 5 minutes, so I will real quick show you a couple things about this. You'll definitely want to learn, read more about it. So if I go into desired state, and the first one I'll show you is, what's a good one? The VM config. We'll start with this one. Let me edit this real quick. And so here's the file that sets what we call a desired configuration. So there's a couple things that are happening here. You can see here I have a DSC resource that I'm importing. It's got a name called XSC. That's a name that I made up. This isn't a built-in one. This is one that I created. And if you look at this, I think you'll understand. You can see here I have a thing called $server, right? By default, it's the current computer, but guess what? If it's a parameter, I can pass it in. So I would run set DSC VM config space that name that I showed you, AZ with the 4-digit number, and it would set it, okay? And you can see here with this page file, on drive C I want nothing, and on drive D I want it to be 1.5 of memory on the machine. In Azure, drive D is a temporary disk that's SSD as opposed to the blob storage. And then in addition here, I want to run this auto-initialize thing. It says true, right? To build this, you can read more about creating custom ones on TechNet, but if I show you mine, which was in here, XSC, if you look at that, here's the page file one. All I'm doing here is a simple call out to WMI, for those of you who've done all that kind of information, right? I'm calling the WMI to get what the page file is for the given drive, and I set the values, right? And then the auto format one's a little bit more interesting because on that one, we don't use WMI, but it's really just a couple settings here to say, look and see what we have here. And if the allocated, if it's a raw partition, I want you to initialize it. And then I want to look at the size. If the size is less than the total, then I want you to create a volume, right? Typical stuff here you'd expect to see when you're creating it. And you can see it's just PowerShell. What I will show you here, I meant to do on the other one, in this module that I create, you'll notice I have a get resource and I have a set resource. every 30 minutes, it would run the get resource function. And if you return a false, it calls set. Desired state. I'm defining what I want the desired state to be. It says, hey, I'm calling a get, and when you in this in here, remember, this is my auto initialized one, so all I'm passing in is true, right? So if it comes in the parameter where it's mandatory that says this string is true, then I want to do something, right? On the other one, if I switch to the first one where I pass in the size, it would call in, and it would say, here's a drive letter. On the get, it would do a drive letter, right? And then I don't have them defined here, but because I had those other properties defined, they would get passed in by position. I'm sorry I didn't do that. Well, I'm running out of time. It calls get. If you return false, it does the set for you. Make sense? Okay. And I have 2 minutes left, and I think that's all I have. Thank you for attending. I'm happy to stick around for questions, the attending parties tonight, and hope you found it helpful.